Remind people who are parked in the structure to make sure you get your stubs, your parking structure stub validated. We're almost ready to kick it off, and I think I'm just going to remind you that this is the second in our Detroiters Speak series for fall 2014. Next week we have a really important one about General Gordon Baker Jr. We'll have, yay, and we're going to have a few folks come and talk about him, including UAW Vice President for the Ford Department, Jimmy Suttles. I'll be talking about him, and David Goldberg from Wayne State University. This is really important because we're going to announce again and really explain the scholarship that we are establishing in General Gordon Baker's name. So be sure to be here next week. And the following week, get your blues dancing shoes on and get your jazzy selves organized, because we'll be at Bert's in the marketplace. But I'll remind you about that as we're coming along to October 30th. I'm going to keep talking for a little minute. I want to say that we owe this evening, this particular evening, to Eleanor Gamalski. Come on, Diana. She's a recent University of Michigan graduate. She's also a former semester in Detroit student, and now we've managed to capture her and Elena Hoey as staff workers for the program. I'm telling you, these guys are great. Because of them, we've been able to do such a better job. Eleanor was the one who came up with the idea of having a panel on Coleman Young, which I thought was like fantastic. Of course, let's do this. She was also one of the ones who came up with the idea of having a scholarship for General Gordon Baker. So there you go. We can never let her go. Okay, just a couple more minutes. Get your last piece of pizza, your last drink of soda pop, and we'll be beginning pretty soon. Is there anything else? Craig, is there anything else I need to say?
I think if you talked about parking.
I talked about parking stuff. Oh gosh, there is something I need to say. Where's Dr. Adele Anderson? Did she sneak off?
We need to get more chairs.
Okay, well, Dr. Adele Anderson, we're eating her food, and we're sitting in her chairs, and we always want to thank the U of M Detroit Center for their generous support of this series and feeding us and housing us and making videos. The videos for all of these programs will be one fine day, thanks to this incredible man in the middle, Mike Moreland, will end up on the U of M Detroit Center site, and you'll be able to get them there soon.
First one's already up.
The first one's already up, you see? That's fantastic. Okay, I think we're ready. Yeah, Dr. Anderson, raise your hand. We just got through singing your praises. And the praises of all your staff that, that supports this function. Stephen, are we ready to go? All right, let's rock and roll, everybody. By the way, my name is Lolita Hernandez, for those of you who don't know. And this is Craig Register, who's the Associate Director here, and the main slave driver, trying to get things going. And I teach in the residential college in the creative writing department. I teach here in the creative writing department as well. Okay. Dr. Stephen Ward is a faculty director of the Semester in Detroit program. He teaches African American history and urban studies in the residential college and in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, DAS, at the University of Michigan. He is also a board member of the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center to Nurture Community Leadership. Bob Bird is a founding partner in the Detroit-based communications firm Bird, Muirhead and Associates. He began his career as a news reporter before joining the administration of Governor William G. Milliken as its executive assistant for public affairs. When Milliken left office at the end of 1982, Byrd came to Detroit, where he became press secretary to the legendary, the one and only, Mayor Coleman A. Young Sr., a position he held for 11 years until Young left office at the end of his 5th term in 1993. He and business partner Georgella Muirhead founded Byrd, Muirhead & Associates in 1998 and have served a wide variety of high-level clients in the intervening years. Reverend Lawrence Simmons is retired from the city of Detroit, where he worked as a political director for Mayor Coleman A. Young. We've got a lot of history sitting up here, okay? And from Wayne County, where he served as Chief Information Officer and Director of Strategic Planning, as Deputy Chief of Police and then Executive Assistant appointed by Mayor Young. Then Mr. Simmons was assigned by Mayor Young to manage large events, including, check this out, the visits of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, and the Tigers' 1984 victory celebration. Reverend Simmons managed Mayor Young's 1981, 1985, 1989 re-election campaigns, for several other candidates for council, judgeships, and other local offices, as well as serving as Detroit coordinator for the Dukakis and Clinton campaigns. He has served in a number of capacities in the Democratic Party. He currently is the pastor of the Baber AME Church. Melba Joyce Boyd is Distinguished Professor and Chair of Africana Studies at Wayne State University. She is the author of 13 books, including Wrestling with the Muse, Dudley Randall, and the Broadside Press, which received the 2005 Black Caucus of the American Library Association Book Honor for nonfiction, and she's also the editor of Roses and Revolutions, the collected writings of Dudley Randall, which received the 2010 Library Michigan Notable Books Award and was a finalist for a 2010 NAACP Image Award in Literature. Her 1994 book, Discarded Legacy, Politics and Poetics in the Life of Francis E.W. Harper, 1825-1911, was widely reviewed and praised by critics. Let's give them a warm
Hello, everyone. So my role is moderator, which means I will not be saying much. There's a lot to be said about Coleman Young, a lot to be shared, a lot to be learned. So we'll jump right into our 3 panelists, and each of them will begin with a 5-minute opening statement addressing either what they think, how they assess Coleman Young's legacy, or something they think is important for you to know at the beginning of this conversation about Coleman Young, which may or may not be the same thing. And I just now decided that the order will be, we'll ask Professor Boyd to go first. So, without further ado, Professor Boyd.
Okay, can you hear me? Is the microphone working?
Yeah.
Okay, is that a yes?
Yeah.
Let's see, too loud. Let's see, I met Coleman Young in 1972, and I just returned to Detroit, finished my undergraduate and then my master's degree in English at Western Michigan University. And in the middle of real intense, shall we say, confrontation with the police and other unseemly forces. So the city was in a lot of conflict at that time, and his election in many ways was the result of the city citizens taking control of the city and stopping the harassment and the actual murders of Detroit citizens. And Coleman Young was, of all of the candidates, with the exception at the time of Ken Copper, who was also, had thrown his hat into the circle, was the only one who said that if he were elected, the first thing he would do would be to fire the police commissioner and to dismantle stress. So this was not a usual election. As one of my friends said, this is a life and death situation. Since there's so many things that we can say about his legacy, I worked on his campaign as so many people did, and so that's not anything special. It was basic. At the same time, he really made a difference in the quality of life in the city, and there are a lot of myths and misrepresentations and distortions of who Coleman Alexander Young was. And I think as a poet, I would like to read the poem that I wrote for him in his honor for the Coleman Young Foundation, which has been in existence now since 1993, I think, and gives scholarships to Detroit graduates, and over 90% of them graduate from college. It's a very successful organization. This poem is entitled Phoenix Rising, from Mayor Coleman Alexander Young, 1918 to 1997. It's a quotation from Dudley Randall. Cities have died, have burned, yet Phoenix light return. Immersed in Detroit, Alabama, black bottom blues, automobile plants, union organizing, and lush life imaginings and syncopated swing inspired in Paradise Valley, the irascible Coleman Alexander Young was reborn in the ashes of freedom battles. Capitalist police harassed him and sabotaged his name. A segregated military clipped his eagle wings and grounded his Tuskegee airmen. FBI spies invaded his privacy and blacklisted him as a communist red, like Paul Robeson and Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, Lorraine Hansberry, and Dr. Martin Luther King, free-thinking, articulate descendants of literate ex-slaves. With bravado and an audacious vocabulary, Coleman exposed the un-American motives of Senator McCarthy's sinister committee, deconstructed the skullduggery and conspiracies to stop crusades to make freedom real, even if it only existed in dreams within the radius of Detroit city limits, in the arsenal of democracy, where the UAW and community elders debated politics with haircuts and barbershops, for young men intended to topple pyramids of unjust hierarchies constructed over 4 centuries. Black and white together, Coleman chimed in unison when Detroit elected him to end police terrorism. This mayor rebuked suburban antipathy, damning the dark city and its brazen leader, a raconteur often seen retelling stories with factory workers on street corners or carousing after hours with radicals convening in beer taverns or reciting an elegy in the bittersweet sanctity of a funeral rite of passage. Republicans tried to banish him. Obsessed federal agencies armed with legal daggers plotted to arrest him. With poison ink and jaundiced headlines, newspaper editors deemed to defame him. But for 20 years, the citizens voted for the tenacious, charismatic Coleman, a phoenix rising from the white ashes of freedom clashes.
Next, Mr. Burke.
It's quite a challenge to try to describe Coleman Young in a relatively brief period of time because there are so many facets to his life and his personality. He was Detroit's longest serving mayor. He was Detroit's first black mayor. His election marked an historic shift in political power in the city and in this region. He was a visionary. He was tenacious. He was creative. He could go into any room, corporate boardroom, community organization, city or suburban audience, and have the people there in the palm of his hand in minutes. When he entered a room, he took control of the room just by his presence. He had a great sense of humor. He was eminently quotable. If any of you have seen his little book of quotes, you'll know what I'm talking about. He also had a great sense of justice and bitterly resented injustice wherever he found it throughout his life. His life was devoted to fighting injustice wherever he found it. He was a very formidable opponent, and a very, very loyal ally. He came from the old school that said all you need to seal a deal is a handshake. You don't need to get the lawyers in the room to nail the details down. His word was good. He was one of the smartest and best read people I've ever known. And that's even though his formal education stopped in high school. It's hard in a short period to give a thorough accounting of all the things that he accomplished as mayor, beginning with opening the doors of opportunity at the city to African Americans for the first time in Detroit history. When he became mayor, the police department in a city that was 50-50 at the time, the police department was 85% white, command structure in the police department was 95% white. And that created the situations that were just discussed. If you look at Detroit today, much of the progress that you see traces to initiative launched by Coleman Young. And each of these initiatives, when he was launching it, was the object of much scorn and criticism from the media, the suburbs, and some Detroiters. Time and again, people said that will never work. And time and again, it did. The city's bustling theater district, its 2 sports stadiums, the rebirth underway along the riverfront, the GM Detroit Hamtramck Assembly Plant, Chrysler Jefferson, North American International Auto Show. Those are just some of the things that he made possible and that wouldn't exist today if he had the courage and leadership to make them happen. And even listing all those things doesn't really give you an idea of how thoroughly he dominated the city and the region for his entire 20 years as mayor. He was truly a giant whose accomplishments are even more remarkable when you compare them to mayors who came before and after him. I want to cover this before I turn it over to Larry, because one of the great myths that has risen through the years is that Coleman Young hated white people. I always tell people that I was white the entire time I worked for him. And I think I would have noticed. And I don't think he would have had me out there speaking on his behalf, including just as a volunteer during his last days in the hospital, if he hated white people. He didn't hate anybody because of their ethnicity or race or religion. He was about in terms of seeing people for who they were, he was as good at that as anybody I think I've known.
Being the political director for Coleman Young is kind of like being the art director for Michelangelo. You really sit in the back and learn more than you ever direct. He is the most brilliant political strategist I have ever read about or worked with, and I have worked with a great many. I've worked in the Mondale, Dukakis, Clinton national campaigns, Senate campaign for Carl Levin, congressional campaigns for Kelly Cheeks Kilpatrick. I architected Bob Vacano's campaign for county executive. Don't hold it against him. So when I say that he is the most brilliant that I have ever met, that is not being said without some understanding, and I'm a student of political history. I'll give you one story. I got a phone call from a person who I won't name because they're still around, and they offered the mayor a deal that they would give him, they would support getting a casino in Detroit if he would relinquish his efforts to get a international trade zone located in Detroit. So he would give up the trade zone, he would get a casino. The mayor, now you realize now, I'm an ordained elder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So I'm quoting here. Is that motherfucker crazy? He then proceeded to give me a lesson about the course of the current of the Atlantic Ocean. He had struck a deal. He says the way the current runs on the Atlantic, it actually runs north of the Atlantic Ocean. So it is very expensive to ship goods south down the Atlantic. So goods that come from Europe to the United States, it's actually cheaper to bring those goods through the St. Lawrence Seaway into Michigan, and then to route them down the I-75 corridor, off of which either side, 25 miles, like 75% of the American population. And so he said, this same characterization wants me to trade in a $100 million casino for a $10 billion international trade zone. He can go have sex with his mother. Now, striking the expletives, he had cut a deal with the longshoremen in New York so that they were influencing their congressional delegation. He, in Michigan, was managing the Michigan delegation, and they had one other delegation who was involved in this deal. This was when he was 70, we left in 78, so he was 76 years old. Sick a lot of the time, home most of the time, but clearly brilliant and understanding what it takes to build the local economy of the city. He is without doubt the best mayor Detroit has ever had. I was challenged. When I began running this campaign, I was 10 years in. I was from 83 to 93. We ran on the position that Detroit had had 7 consecutive years of balanced budgets. When was the last time that happened? When Coleman Young was being accused of being a racist in a city which was 75% African American, his appointed staff remained 50% black and 50% white from the day he came in office until the day he left, on purpose. I'm pointing out these vignettes to try to give you a breath. I'll end with this last story. The man had ice water in his veins. In when did we start the Angels Night campaign? That must have been, what, like, was it 84? So we are, I'm coming, at that point, I just started working for him. By the way, I did not manage the 81 campaign. It was the 80, 85 and 89 campaigns that I managed. I'm driving down John C. Lodge, and the freeway is on fire. Literally. The grass is burning. I'm on my way to a political event for Mondale that's being held at Joe Louis Arena. So at that point, I'd been appointed 3rd Deputy Chief of Police. So I stopped on my way downtown. I stopped at the fire department where it is absolute chaos. The police department, where they're in the command room, and they are completely calm. They know exactly what's going on. It's still working. Where Deputy Chief Bannon is actually in charge that night. He knows, his cars are reporting back to the command post where the fires are and how they are progressing. I drive over to Cobo and I tell the mayor that we have a problem and what's going on. Right about that moment, somebody whose name I'm not going to call because it's still very much prominent in local civic affairs, comes running down the aisle. Their eyes are like, I got no beady eyes, so I can't do this, but they got like great big saucer eyes. And they say, the city's lost, the city's lost, it's burning down, we lost, we can't control it. The mayor is talking to a big donor. He gets up, says, walk with me. He asked me, okay, tell me what you've seen. I described to him the situation that I found over the police department, what I found in the fire department, and I strongly recommend that he talk to Bannon before he makes a decision. In the meantime, this person is insisting that the mayor call in all the suburban fire departments, make a public announcement that the city is in an emergency state, and virtually declare martial law. The mayor takes the donor down to this private room that he had on the first floor. If you didn't know it was there, you didn't know it was there. He has the guy sit down, has me keep him company. He goes and gets on the phone. Spends about 15 minutes on the phone while I'm, schmoozing the guy with the deep pockets. He comes off the phone, he says to this person, we are not declaring a state of emergency. I'm placing Bannon in charge of the city. The trucks will be dispatched by the police department, and within 3 hours, the situation was under control. He never flinched. Ice water. Made exactly the right decision in spite of crazy recommendations. And that characterized him the entire time I worked for him.
That's what we do a double clap, and we skip Mr. Bird's clap. So another contributor to this conversation is you, the audience. And as I'm looking at the audience, it's actually, I want to say, looks like a beautiful audience. I'm not just trying to flatter you. I mean, physical attributes of beauty too, but I mean, the broader range of people here is a beautiful collection of people. Judging by the people I know, who I expect their backgrounds, and also the age. So we have people in this room who were around, including our panelists when Coleman Young was here, and we should recall for ourselves his 20-year tenure. He was elected in 1973 and left office in 1993. So we have people in the room who remember him in office, and we have some who do not. We have people in the room who will have strong feelings, opinions about him, came into this room with strong opinions and feelings. Others who are just learning and hearing about him for the first time. So that's going to make for a rich conversation, so we want to move quickly to having comments and questions from the audience. But to move us in that direction, I want to pose one question to each of our panelists, if they can each address this quickly, which is this. So here's the context for the question. Well, we just heard a glowing picture of Coleman Young, right? We heard a few of you clap, so forth. But many of us know that Coleman Young was not loved by everyone, as referenced here. For some, he was a controversial figure. So I'd like to ask each of you to take a moment to tell us why you think that was the case, that Coleman Young was controversial, or the picture that you painted of him was not held by others, as a way to throwing us into a broader conversation.
Well, when you call people motherfucker to their face, it's hard to get
Raphael, are you quoting again?
I'm quoting. He had a reporter, Bob needs to really tell this story, who was in the office, who finally kept pestering the mayor, got on the mayor, so for the chapter 7 was the, but I'll let him finish that story. But the mayor would look you in the face and say things that people were not used to hearing. And so he would say things like, when they were talking to him about guns and gun control in the city of Detroit, he said, you want me to give up all my guns? And we're surrounded with all these crazy, epithet, goddamn guns, playing an army in the woods, and you want us to give up our guns? That human excrement is not going to happen. Well, though the language was floral, the fact was true. And so people resented that. One of the biggest misstatements is that Coleman Young told white people to hit 8 Mile and get out of town. I ask anyone to go back and read the record. What he said was that there are going to be no more criminals in this city, and all the criminals in Detroit can hit 8 Mile and keep going. He didn't tell them to go set up a house in Warren. And he didn't tell white people to go there. But it was picked up and reported in such a way that it was taken to mean that he was asking white people to leave the city. So I think the acerbic way he spoke, the very direct way he spoke, but I'm going to echo something Bob said, I'm going to let go. There was never a room, whether it was the Grosse Point Chamber of Commerce, whether it was the Bloomfield Chamber of Commerce, whether it was the Detroit Economic Club, that Coleman Young did not walk into, and within 15 minutes had everybody in the room with a smile on their face rushing up to get his autograph. None, ever. That belies his personal charm or the reputation he had and does not account for the enormous personal charm. You know, he didn't steal office 20 years. He was elected.
Yeah, the other piece of that story about was his inauguration speech when he said, hit the road, hit the 8 Mile Road. 2 days after that, at the time, the audience applauded. Everybody knew what he meant. This was over at the Ford Auditorium. 2 days later, the Detroit News sent reporters out to Warren and some other suburbs to say to people, Coleman Young said this, what do you think he meant? And it was a front page story in the news, you know, suburbs react to Young's statement. And it was the beginning. I mean, the base or the core reason for a lot of the hatred of Coleman Young is race. And there were a lot of white people who didn't like the idea of any black person becoming mayor of Detroit, let alone Coleman Young. I mean, for them, it was sort of like, if you've read the history books, it was sort of like Castro had come out of the hills and the revolution had succeeded. And a lot of people, and Coleman Young was not about to apologize for pursuing policies that were intended to create opportunity where there had been none. And because of that, his determination to make sure that that happened, a lot of people, a lot of white people, particularly in the suburbs, but a lot of Detroit white people at the time, just couldn't stand the idea of having somebody black in charge. And I mean, it's part of the legacy of this region, the racial divide. It's still there. It's not talked about as much today, but it's still there, and it still affects public policy decisions in the region. But I mean, that's the basic reason for all the animosity that was directed toward him. It's all the very core of it is race.
I think you to understand this dynamic, the young people in the room, it's sort of the way that the country has responded to having a black president. The racism that comes out of that section of the population that is just absolutely appalled at the idea of having a black president of the United States. That was the feeling here in Detroit at the time. And Coleman was the exact person and personality to make that happen, because the people needed someone who would be aggressive, who would stand up for them and not back down. And he would say things out loud that most of us were thinking, but because we went to Sunday school, we would probably tone it down a bit. So he did what we call talking back. And he did it in a manner that may have angered a lot of people, but it also endeared him to the people. And it's also a fact, and I think you should be aware, that a lot of times when they reference the migration of people away from the city and into the suburbs, the migration started really in the 1950s when they began to build up the suburbs and so forth. We're not Americans, we can't keep anything, we usually throw it away. And so that migration started all around the country. But also, more specifically, there's also the idea that after the '67 riot, that a lot of people began to move to the suburbs. Not at the rate that they moved to the suburbs after the election of Coleman Young. They absolutely could not stand to have a black person in charge of the city. The loss of political control actually enraged them, and that's why they left. So there's a tremendous amount of racism, and I think in some ways it's all over the country. It's just that in Detroit, we talk about it more, we deal with it, and we don't back down. In other places, when they talk about Detroit being so segregated and what Coleman did and the black people, what they did to the city, the black people didn't do anything to the city but save it and try to keep it together with bubble gum and shoestring. While the big three abandon us because we don't own and control the means of production, straight up. And yet they seem to think we're supposed to be able to manufacture money and be able to do the things that we can't possibly do without economic support. And so they want to blame Coleman. And yet, when you look back at what has happened to this city economically, he was the only mayor who kept this city fiscally responsible for many years. And when he needed more money, he came to the citizen, he says, look, I'm going to have to raise the taxes. And we voted to pay more taxes in order to keep the city going. He could do that because the people believed him. And I think that because he was successful, if he had been a real screw, they would have liked that. But he wasn't only that, he did things to bring this city together that had never happened before. His support of culture was unprecedented. We had so many things and activities that brought the various community, the writing community, and we had all kinds of things that went on. The ethnic festivals downtown, and it wasn't just, it was every ethnic group you can imagine. And people came to those, the jazz festivals, the blues festivals. All of that happening in this city. It was vibrant and happening when Coleman was the mayor. And it was, I think, the first 10 years before the automobile industry went into its first major dive. The city was just absolutely amazing. It was absolutely amazing, and it was wonderful. And it sort of, for me, as a young person, that was the glory years, for this city. And it's been, as far as I'm concerned, what they're trying to do now is nothing compared to what Coleman Young and the city achieved in the 1970s and 80s.
One other point, the mayor's sometimes colorful language gets a lot of attention, but he also could go in sort of a church or a corporate group or an academic group and impress them with his grasp of the English language and his knowledge of the subject. He used to say that he was bilingual, and it was. He would go in. He was in churches regularly, speaking, and spoke equally appropriately in the church as he did in any other situation.
Feeling questions and comments emerging from the audience. So we have a mic there. Sam was standing up. I think you will be marshaling the mic.
A couple of things real quick. My name is Glenda McGadney.
And please.
My name is Glenda McGadney. I've been in Detroit most of my life. And my question is about the mass transit and what happened under the Coleman Young administration. Also, I know you already talked about this, about stress, and when he came into office and how he turned things around with the police department and how it affected us as African Americans, and why we have most of the time that we've been in this city have really distrusted the police department. So can you expound on those two?
I can speak to some of that. Let me take the mayor from a different perspective. The American economy has matured through industrialism to a place where most manufacturing can be done now by robots. The inflection point in this transformation happened in the midst of Coleman Young's tenure. If the mayor had a blind spot, it was that having been nurtured and raised in the Great Depression and in the Franklin Roosevelt idea of government, I'm not sure he appreciated that there was a sea change in how Detroit made its money. He knew it was important because the Poletown plant, the Jefferson plant are the only plants built inside cities in the late 20th century. I want to create that backdrop because in 1950 there were 117,000 people working in Ford Rouge. Today there are 3,000. Those 114,000 jobs did not move to the east side or to the west side. They either left the country or they moved into machines. The income generated by those 114,000 people and their grandchildren is gone. So the economic underpinning of the city was evaporating under Coleman Young throughout his time. And he was constantly maneuvering to manage it. In spite of that, and Bob really should be the one to speak to this, the relationship between the police department and the community of Detroit was so good. And there's his son walking into the room now. What's up?
Hey, everybody. The relationship was so good that the fewest number of fatalities between police and community was occurring in the city of Detroit, in spite of this growing tension. So the economic backdrop is of contracting personal income for people in the city, while the cost of running government and the cost of doing things is going up. That's really what makes his balancing of the budgets such a phenomenal event. And really, until the Free Press wrote the article maybe 6 months ago, no one gave him credit for it. But finally somebody went back, and again, I tell you like I tell the folks in church, don't believe anything I say, read the book. Go back and check the facts. Check the facts of the racial makeup of the organization. So his management of the police was simply to make the decision the police have to reflect the community in which they serve, and we are not going to be an occupying army. And part of what propelled him to office, and Melvin would know this because we were involved in some political organizations, no different than the Democratic Party back in those days. The anti-stress campaign, in my opinion, is the organizational form that catapulted Coleman Young into office. Past other people who were expected to win, that grassroots campaign driven by the left wing of this city and the grassroots folks in this city is what propelled him. He got through the primary, if I'm recalling my numbers correctly, with 23% of the vote and won the general election by like 60, 56, 44. If I'm going from memory now, so I may be slightly off. But he just got through the primary and then built a coalition of whites and blacks that then elected him to office. And this was on the premise that he would pacify the police and create an environment which he succeeded in doing, in which the animosity between police and community would be changed. It took me too long to say that.
The other part of the question, the mass transit, in the 1970s, it was around 75, Coleman Young, Governor Milliken, Henry Ford II, and Max Fisher, who was a very wealthy financier here in town, went to Washington, met with William Coleman, who was the transportation secretary at the time for the Ford administration. William Coleman and Coleman Young had been Tuskegee Airmen together. And with that relationship, and then with Max Fisher and Henry Ford and Milliken's position in the Republican Party, the Ford administration committed $600 million to Southeast Michigan if the local units of government here could come up with a plan for mass transit. Well, back then that was a lot of money, and if they had been able to come together, we'd have a real light rail system in this region now. But the suburbs, suburban politicians in particular, wouldn't do it, and because, among other things, they didn't want to make it too easy for black folks to get into the suburbs. And the $600 million laid there, never went anywhere. And the People Mover was actually built. It was a demonstration project. It came from the Carter administration, and it was originally built to be at the end of a light rail system. So people could take the light rail system downtown, and they'd get on the People Mover to move around downtown. It was never intended to be a standalone system. But it's another example of where the region's racial politics, and particularly a lot of suburban politicians who as the years progressed, really got elected campaigning against Coleman Young. But the racial politics of the region really hurt the city and the region.
I have a question that sort of relates to that, and one person in particular was L. Brooks Patterson, and I think it's been, to my mind, over the years, the single person who has put forward most consistently the narrative that Detroit's problems are due to corrupt, racist, incompetent black leadership. Can you comment, I don't want to say on the relationship, but maybe on the perspective of Mayor Young with regard to L. Brooks Patterson?
Mayor Young once said about L. Brooks Patterson that he has all the qualities of a dog except loyalty.
L. Brooks Patterson is the county executive of Coleman County and has been, and his rise to power came because he was the attorney for Irene McCabe and a group of white parents in Pontiac who viciously opposed the idea of busing. Brooks was their attorney. He then parlayed that position as their attorney into being prosecutor, and then when the county executive position became vacant, I can't remember the gentleman's name who preceded him, Dan Murphy, when he retired, Brooks then parlayed his position from prosecutor to county executive.
And actually, the change was so dynamic because Dan Murphy and Coleman Young actually had a good relationship. They worked together on a lot of projects. But when Brooks came in, that was the end of it. I mean, his entire political career was based on playing the race card.
He is. He is.
We have a question here in the front.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying your comments about waiting for your book. I was wondering if you could speak to how Mayor Young would have addressed the whole emergency manager law and the bankruptcy situation.
Well, if Coleman Young had been mayor, we wouldn't have been in that situation. Because, as Larry pointed out, the Free Press did a big Sunday spread last October, I think it was. And it was basically how we got here. And the second headline was, and don't blame Coleman Young. And they made the point that in the last 60 years, he had been the most conservative fiscal manager the city had had. And he was a very conservative fiscal manager. And so if he had been in charge, if he had been mayor, I mean, we wouldn't have, I mean, some of the deals that are now in the bankruptcy court, like the $1.4 billion bond deal, that wouldn't have happened because he did not, I mean, when he was in a budget meeting, believe in playing with phony dollars.
Right.
I mean, the budget director, Danny Waldstecher, who was brilliant in his own right. I mean, he had the whole city budget in his head. But I mean, they would joke around, but when it came down to making decisions, it was, okay, what are the real numbers, and what can we afford? And so, I mean, the simple answer is, if he were mayor, if he had been mayor later, if he were mayor now, we wouldn't have been in bankruptcy, we wouldn't have needed an emergency manager.
Let me use this as a launch point to talk about another dynamic. I think this is outside the statute of limitations, so I can tell this story. Coleman Young was the what's the title for the head of the Senate, state Senate? Speaker, not Speaker, that's the House. Senate Majority Leader, thank you. He was the elected He was the elected floor leader in a predominantly white chamber. He understood the nuances. When I'm doing political training for candidates or for classes, one of the things I say that a skill that you have to develop, like a bird rides currents in the air. If you ever watch a bird flying and they'll stop flapping their wings and they'll move because they're riding, rising and falling currents, you have to be able to do that in politics. And I remember the mayor once telling me, we had a meeting with this pollster. The pollster was giving him some really crazy advice. I remember the mayor saying to me after they left the room, you don't ever let anybody's numbers take the place of your political instinct. I'm saying this because the mayor recognized that he had to relate to Republicans. And so while Republicans would get up and pillory him, I mean, they would talk about him in the UP, they would talk about him in West part of the state, the mayor recognized that the mother's milk of politics is what? Money. So, when he needed to influence a particular vote, he had friends who were in Colorado. He would make a donation to his friends in Colorado, who would make a donation to the Colorado Republican Party, who would make a donation to a Republican candidate in Michigan. This is true. That's probably illegal. Probably illegal then, probably illegal now. But the bottom line is, when it came time for that crucial vote and he needed one or two, he understood how politics worked and he understood how to use those mechanisms. Now, what does that got to do with the emergency manager? The reason we have an emergency manager is because Kwame Kilpatrick, who was just as smart as Coleman Young was, but lacked Coleman Young's moral center. So Coleman Young cussed, but he was a very moral man. And he understood the integrity of holding the office that he held. And there were some things he not only would he not do, he would not tolerate those who worked for him doing. So he would not have expanded the city's workforce like Dennis Archer did, knowing that he didn't have the money to support such an expansion. In fact, during the mayor's tenure, the workforce for the city of Detroit shrunk to its lowest level until maybe now. Because he understood you can't hire people that you don't have the money to pay. So he would never have he would never have ballooned the city to that state. He would never have cut the deals that were cut, which were so egregious that the federal court threatened to take people to jail when they began to unravel them and see what the Wall Street folks had done. He would never have done that. So that we wouldn't have gotten to the emergency manager, because he would not have allowed the sequence of events that led to the financial crisis to emerge. That's the brilliance of him. He was bred in a time of great need in the Depression, and over the course of his struggles in life, he developed a moral sense that led him to make very good decisions, and he was brilliant with numbers. Brilliant with numbers. So we wouldn't have gotten him. He would have begun the political maneuvering long before anybody ever said anything about the emergency man. As he did. As he did.
Larry pointed out that the Mayor Coleman Young was the majority floor leader in the state Senate, which was actually at the time the #2 position, because the Democratic caucus was afraid to have a black majority leader. And so, even though he had the title of majority floor leader, he was in effect the leader of the Democratic caucus.
Yes. Which at that time was the majority, if you can believe that.
I just wanted to examine perhaps another perspective in terms of the legacy of Coleman Young. It was referred to earlier in the comments of the panel, I think it was Mr. Simmons, said that there was a left-wing group that was probably responsible for giving Coleman Young the kind of support that he needed to become elected mayor. I wanted to comment on that characterization. Actually, these were young people who, prior to a candidate like Coleman Young, probably could never realize their dream of becoming 100% participants in the political process and how the city ran and participate as human beings in having homes and a job to feed their families. Well, Coleman Young inspired people to dream, to believe that they could have power, become judges in the court, run a police force. But it wasn't just Detroit. His legacy was spread across the country and the world. Wherever black people live, they looked at Coleman Young as a guy who was establishing a precedence for how cities can be run by black people. Now, even though black people were fundamentally declared inferior by most white people and institutions, he proved that that declaration was false. And that's what I think was resented from the white side of the argument. But the other side, this so-called left side, was not really left. It was just black people like myself, a teenager, begin to believe that I can be empowered and empower others to take control of our own life. So what we saw during his existence was a power struggle between those who wanted him out of power because he was black and those who wanted him to stay in power because he represented the interests of African Americans. And I think that's an important part of his legacy, is that the legitimacy of African Americans wanting to be in power, wanting to be in control, and sharing that power with everybody.
I want to give you the factual basis for my left-wing statement. The anti-stress movement was organized primarily by the...
Always back to make sure everyone knows what's stressful.
Stop
Some robberies and safe streets.
And do what to safe streets? Enjoy safe streets. It was a police hit squad.
Yep.
Literally. And, because I, believe it or not, I was a young man then too. Had hair. And you were always alert to where the police were, because if you got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, they would say that you were attempting to rob someone and kill you, execute you on the street. Again, go back and check the facts. The Dodge Revolutionary Union movement and its allies began to organize around this with Kitty Cockrell and several others, General Baker, some other names you may know if you're familiar with that history, began organizing and demanding an end to stress. This movement culminated in a march down Woodward of more than 10,000 people. That march galvanized the city so that when the mayor ran, he ran in a race with John Moak, with John Nichols, with Mel Ravitz, and Ed Bell. That's what I was trying to remember. Ed Bell, with Mel Ravitz being the liberal candidate that was expected to win this race. Inside the labor movement, they were supporting Mel Ravitz. The Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, which had spread, become Forum and other revolutionary union movements throughout the UAW, organized and split with the UAW leadership and organized behind Coleman Young. They put together, with young people, as you correctly identified, sufficient votes to get the mayor through the primary. Again, with 23% to Nichols, somewhere around 45% in this race. He then built a coalition of blacks and whites. And let me be real clear about this. Every white person was not opposed to Coleman Young.
Right.
Let's be real clear about this. He couldn't have been elected if that were true. And the mayor reached out to the white community in many ways, and in many ways that outreach was responded. There was and still is significant racism in this region, but make no mistake, significant segments of the white community stayed with the mayor. To the extent, I'm going to talk to it, But to the extent that in the 1990 census, 200,000 whites lived in the city of Detroit, which if they had left and formed a separate city, would have been the largest, second largest city in the state of Michigan. Larger than Warren, larger than Livonia. More whites lived in the city than lived in any other one city in the state. So there's a conception that there was just a breakdown racial lines around the mayor. It wasn't that, it was more nuanced than that. And our analysis of him has to be more nuanced to appreciate the fact that out of the Coleman Young administration, Conrad Mallett, who became an executive with the DNC and Supreme Court Justice, Dennis Archer, who became mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick, whose mother was part of the Coleman Young Network, became mayor and state senator. Carolyn Kilpatrick became a congresswoman. I managed several campaigns. Bob and Georgella set up a successful business. Melba is at the University of Michigan. My sons are in D.C. In government and public affairs, who were raised up in this culture of consciousness. The reach of Coleman Young's effect, you are absolutely correct, reaches far beyond the city of Detroit.
Add a couple of things to that. Larry was talking about his ability to work across the aisle. When he decided to run for mayor, he actually had to go to the Supreme Court and file a lawsuit because there was a state law at the time that said if you held a public office, you couldn't run for another office if you were in the middle of your term. And the Supreme Court threw that out, and he was able to run for mayor. The first person to give him a contribution to his campaign was a state representative named Tom Ford from Grand Rapids, who was a brother of Gerald Ford, who was the president, or wasn't the president at that point, was about to become the president. And one of his colleagues in the Senate, a guy named Charlie Zoller from Benton Harbor, who was a wealthy farmer from Benton Harbor, and one of the head Republicans, threw a big fundraiser for him over on the western side of the state to help his mayoral campaign. So, and the other thing that if you studied him at all, you know that he and the governor at the time, William Milliken, had a very close working relationship. And the mayor always said that Milliken was the best governor the state had ever had. And the two of them, their relationship was such that when Milliken decided in 1981, actually, at the end of 81, he wasn't going to run for another term, before he had the press conference, he made one phone call, and that was to Coleman Young. Didn't tell anybody else. In 93, when Coleman Young decided he wasn't going to run, the night before, he talked to one person, and that was Governor Milliken. But that was the closeness of their relationship.
Can I say something really quick? I'm sorry, I just wanted to say something just really quickly. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for doing this and for all you're doing, because a lot of times in the political business, people come and go, but the fact that you're doing this, you're honoring our Father, you keep that spirit alive. And so I'm so thankful for what you're doing as young people, and I hope that can inspire you to keep the legacy of service on, because his legacy lives through you, and one of his greatest accomplishments, I think, is the Coleman Young Foundation and investing in young people. And I really believe that he gave his todays so that we can have the tomorrow that we're living in. I also just wanted to say some real quick things. One, you talked about my father being as smart as Kwame Kilpatrick. I love Kwame Kilpatrick. He's a great man, but Kwame Kilpatrick is not smart as my father. I had to say, that's my dad, man. Come on. And I also just want to say about the thing about the money transfer, as far as I'm concerned, my father did not do anything or do anything illegal. So I want to be walking out thinking, okay? But bottom line, I just want to say again, thank you so much for all that you're doing, because I really believe that you are the next generation of leaders. You are the next generation. You are the pillars of greatness that this city is going to be built on. And I think that when we do reach that pinnacle, we're going to have all of you to thank. So I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you so much for honoring my father. I appreciate it. God bless you all. Thank you for your time.
I just want to tell one more story. I know we're running out of time. I love these are some of my I love these stories about the mayor. In Milliken, when Bob talked about Governor Milliken, I think it was let's see, Milliken left in 82, at the end of 82. So this would have been the 78 campaign. 78 campaign. There's a guy named McCullough. Was it McCullough that was a Democratic candidate? Fitzgerald. The mayor, who had a great relationship with Milliken, was being pressured by the Democratic Party to campaign for the Democratic candidate, which was Fitzgerald. So I think it must have been about 2 weeks before the election. Now, the timing of this is important because absentee ballots go out 3 weeks before the election. 75% of the absentee ballots are cast in the first week that they're sent out. I mean, I don't know how many are political junkies, but it's free political advice. So, the mayor goes out to campaign for Fitzgerald about 3 weeks or 2 weeks before the end of the election. He went to Flint, he went to Saginaw, and I think he went somewhere up the I-75 corridor. What's that? Flint, Saginaw, what's the other? Bay City. He went to Flint, Saginaw, Bay City, and campaigned for the Democratic candidate, and never once campaigned for him in the city of Detroit. So when they said, after the feet ever campaigned for the candidate, he said, yeah, I would have campaigned for him, a Pontiac in Flint. But never once did he turn his back on his buddy Bill Milliken.
Yeah, they had a meeting at the Manugian, probably in September of that year, maybe in August. And I was working for Milliken at the time. And afterwards, I was talking to George Weeks, who was the chief of staff, who had come down with him to the meeting. And I said, how did it go? And George said, he's not going to lift a finger. And so the Sundays, every Sunday from that time on, we were down in Detroit, speaking in all the main churches. And there was a great picture of the Monday paper before the election. Milliken was in the pulpit of a church, and Bill Fitzgerald was sitting on the steps outside the church waiting to get in. So that was the depth of the relationship.
Let's go to the next question.
Yes, I have a question. Right now, like Detroit is going through like 350 to like 700 water shutoffs a day, trying to regionalize the water system. To my understanding, there's been a long since battle going on back to the Coleman young days. So I would like for you guys to maybe give us some history on what was going on with the water back then and how Coleman stopped what was going on, what was trying to happen back then, and what's being brought back in light right now.
The art of politics is the art of the deal. And if you're going to be successful, particularly if you're in the center seat, you absolutely must be able to form coalitions with people on the other side of the aisle. No elected official, certainly nobody as a chief executive, will last if they don't have the capacity to work out issues with people on the other side. So the mayor would work with suburban water officials around the water board. But he was smart enough to realize that you always have to have a stick. What most people don't realize is the Detroit Water Department produces water for $1 and ships it to Warren. What they don't realize is that Warren adds on $20 to the $1 that Detroit charges them for that water. Don't believe me? Check the book.
It's true.
Check the book. So anytime they would start to pressure the mayor and he couldn't sit down and reason with them, he would take out the rate schedule and say, if you really want to have this discussion, I will publish this in the Warren Daily News, or whatever newspaper was out there at the time. I will publish these facts in the Warren or the Oakland or whatever Daily News, And people would say, well, I'm talking about this. Yeah, we got to work this thing out. One more story. I got these stories. I got to tell these stories. And again, I see him being recorded, so I'm not going to call any names. But a very prominent, powerful person had come to see the mayor, and this was in the office. For reasons I have no idea. But the mayor, I tell you, I learned more sitting on the back wall in Coleman Young than I ever learned in all the books that I've read a lot about politics ever. So I'm sitting over here, and the person's sitting in front of the mayor's desk, and they started having disagreement. And so this person slams their hand down on the desk, said, I don't have to stand for this. The mayor, who really never cussed when he was having to take care of business, looked at this person and said, first name of the person, if you walk outside this door, it's war. In as calm a voice as I'm speaking to you now. Powerful person. You can't talk to me like that. And we're not going to have it. We're going to work together. We're going to have to learn how to work together. And I'm not going to stand it. I'm just not going to stand for it. When all of that blustering got through talking, they had moved from the door back to the seat, whereupon they cut the deal. If you're going to work in politics, you have to know how to work both sides of the aisle.
I think in terms of the water issue, the water was the one thing that the city had that everybody wanted.
And it's revenue generating.
And it's revenue generating, and it's the one thing, and what's happening now is particularly scary because the planet is in trouble and everybody wants some water. And most of the water is right here in the Great Lakes. And the city of Detroit has a plant that basically, purifies it, generates it, and so forth. So control of that is a huge political currency right now. And at this point, I think it's gone because of this whole emergency manager. Correct me if I'm wrong. Now it's gone into a regional board situation. And there are things happening now to people who live in the city that would not have happened if it had not gone into that particular dynamic. And it's really, really sad. And I remember not being in the room, but knowing people were in the room, and they were trying to take the water then, and Coleman said he let all this shit in it before he would let them have it. And I totally understand now why he was so adamant about that. Because there were times in government when things would not happen that are happening here now, like there were the municipal ordinances where you could not turn off the heat during the winter time because it was considered inhumane.
It still happens.
And yeah, but it's not executed. The water, people not to have water, that is a fundamental human right. And it is just unbelievable. They're doing it not just to control the water, but to control the land. They're trying to move people out of certain areas so that they can take the city back over and reorganize it and repopulate it the way that they want it to be. Gentrification or Negro removal.
Yes.
Okay, let's get a question over here. A comment out of page 216 of our stuff, which was part of our assignment, our reading assignment, which Coleman says that if the city had been prosperous and white, he knows at election time it would have run me out of the race before either one of us could break at a sweat. And that's on page 216. What hasn't been mentioned with the history and the legacy behind Coleman Young is the community-based, the machine that he had with utilizing Virginia Park District Councils, the grassroots community, and those individuals that was able to come together out of the need of what was lacking in the city of Detroit. If you start looking into the history of, similar to what's happening now, but in 67, the riot, which that photograph, which was put on exhibit on behalf of Detroit Public Schools, that's taken on Philadelphia off of Rosa Parks, which was formerly 12. Yes. So as a part of your history of learning about Detroit, knowing what was happening prior to, what was happening during this administration, and what is happening now afterwards, in order to do your final reflection at the end of your course, you will get the full perspective. But making comment of knowing, of not forgetting the grassroots, and I'm representing my mom. She was a hard worker for Coleman Young. This is in 1972, prior or 73, prior to the election. When you come about the citywide Citizens Police Council, because the stress, that's why that community base was created, so you can have a relationship with the community and the police department. So you needed liaisons from the community to build and bridge that relationship, so we can have a safer environment for those walking the streets and for businesses, etc. But so you can look at, and in here, if you take a moment, I have a photograph of Mr. Simmons with the afro. So knowing that, even with this here, on this photo, this is one of the original bulletins that Coleman is observing here at this program of the 20 years later on Virginia Park. So if you have a minute before we leave, you're more than welcome to look at it. But knowing that it's also out of the police, Detroit Police Commission of hiring minorities and females, as far as with females. And also with, he said that in inauguration, January 2nd, 1974, the automobile production was at its lowest point since 1950. It was the oil embargo. Japanese danced on our heads as white people tiptoed past out of town. The American Motor moved headquarters from Detroit to Southfield. Layoffs was difficult to find jobs in Detroit. There was an unemployment epidemic, and he also had to make hard decisions of laying off up to 4,000 city workers. Also, the nation was in recession. The foreign policy Republican, I put Nixon in quotations, was in office during that time. And I also remember things that stood out to me of Coleman's quotes was that at his later time was that from base through a second party of Martha Jean, the Queen, or Martha Jean Steinberg, who had a talk radio show at 12 o'clock noon on AM radio, was the fact that he said all he ever wanted to do was help his people. So that resonated with me. And the next thing that was mentioned, or was to remember at this point, was do not give up Detroit jewels. That was the water, and because we received money from Milliken Relationship, which is out of our assignment, because Detroit was taking care of the zoo, Detroit was taking care of DIA, and it's another one, the third one. DIA, it's three of them. And then out of that exchange, then Milliken, they awarded Detroit with $35 million. And that's not that hard stuff. That's in our homework assignment that's listed. But just keep in remembrance that even behind Coleman Young, he had smart people that was behind him, that was willing to work for change and to take it to another level, to take it to a next generation, like we all are now in 2014, keeping the legacy alive. All right.
Okay, listen, it's 8:37. I promised one comment here.
Real quick, where are the readings? Tell us all where these readings are.
Okay, the readings are at the U of M Detroit site. Mike has set something up.
Detroit Center.
U of M Detroit Center site, where the whole course is set up, and you can go in week by week and see what the readings are. They're the same readings that students go to the U of M website or C-Tool site to get. So that way everybody's getting everything. Okay? What we're gonna do is we're gonna have you make your comments, and then we'll hear from the panel, and then we'll have to break up. That's it.
Thank you. My name is Eric G. LaRosa. I'm a U of M grad class of 81, College of Architecture.
Right.
And I just turned 56 years old. So that means that in 1973, when Coleman Young Sr. was first elected as Detroit's first black man, I was 15 years old. He was the first political campaign that I got involved with. Coleman Young did a lot for black people, but he was very diplomatic. And the one example that I want to point out to, because of time constraints, is there was poor relationship between the black community that was based in Detroit and the predominantly Polish community in Hamtramck. And what he did to bridge that gap was, I think the statue still stands, I think it's 3rd and Lafayette, of General Thaddeus Kosciuszko, Thaddeus Kosciuszko or something like that. He's a Polish war hero. And what he did was, I think he went to Hamtramck, and he had that statue commissioned to honor Polish war hero General Thaddeus Kosciuszko, and he had that statue, and I think it still stands downtown 3rd Lafayette. And since then, from that time, the Polish people, predominantly Polish people of Hamtramck, loved him. So that shows that Coleman Young was a diplomat and got along with people across the racial spectrum.
In the interest of affirmative action, there's a white guy here who'd like to ask a question. I'd like to have him ask him, because ain't nobody else white have the courage to raise their hand. I'm just saying, you know.
You'll have it, Mary. I wanted to ask you, I was, when Blanchard lost to Engler, and I think that Coleman Young was excellent at getting the vote out. And for some reason, he didn't work too hard. I know that he had a kind of a tiff with Blanchard at that time. And I was wondering if you guys could explain that, because when I woke up that morning and found out that Engler won, my heart just sunk, and our state paid a heavy price for it, I think.
I will tell you, in my opinion, why Blanchard lost that.
If I may interject 1 second, the reason why we're quite on time is because there's a bus that we're taking U of M students back to campus, so go ahead and answer, but...
And then that's it.
Right, so...
Quick answer. The first ad that James Blanchard ran in that campaign was of a white man with a flat hat yelling in the face of a black male. Go back and check the record. I'm just saying, not just you, but go back and check the record. This created an animosity, because I worked at that campaign for Blanchard. We were in the hole from that moment forward, trying to and he did not come and campaign. He didn't set up a campaign office because he was afraid of alienating white voters, so he would not set up a campaign office in Detroit, and he did not campaign in Detroit. That's why he lost. And he lost by 1 vote per precinct in that election. I was in the midst of that.
And there were also, I mean, their relationship was never warm and fuzzy, but there were a couple of occasions where the mayor went to Lansing, shook hands with Blanchard on an agreement, and Blanchard didn't follow through on it. And if you, in politics, if you make a deal and you don't follow through, I mean, Coleman Young was old school. If you shook his hand, you better follow through on it. And it didn't happen.
The comment over there said that there were smart people behind Coleman Young. I think we heard from 3 of them, so let's please thank them for this.
Yeah, I just want to remind people, come back next week, 7 o'clock. We're going to be talking about General Gordon Baker. His name was mentioned here this evening in relationship to the anti-stress movement, and there's plenty more to find out about him. Thank you very much for attending.